Perhaps I shall say that don't hesitate to intervene if you think that I am talking too fast, explaining things. Because probably I have a tendency that I am used to give lectures for economists, and sometimes perhaps I go too fast because you have very different backgrounds. So, yeah. Well, all over the world in the 1990s, for example, in the Swedish Parliament, the US economic system with strong property rights and weak trade unions was described as a positive example. I remember my political opponents in the Parliament telling me all the time that we must do as in the United States. And during the Ronald Reagan years in the 1980s, big tax cuts, especially for the richest, was motivated with a trickle-down effect. As the rich enrich themselves, their spending and investment will trickle down to the less privileged more effectively than it would through transfers financed by taxing the rich. That was the general idea, hailed by many economists and sort of a dominating idea in the field of economics. But military spending and lower tax income led to deficits in the US federal budget and in balance of trade. But dollar confidence and geopolitical might recycled capital flows. A major part of the surplus in balance of payment in other countries was transferred to the US and were instantly turned into direct investments, shares, new financial instruments, loans and profits in US banks. So it's a very much of a sort of paradox if you compare to the economic theory of competitive perfect markets. US had big deficits, both in international trade, balance of payments, but also in federal budget. And according to economic theory, that would weaken the dollar and make it unpopular to invest in the United States. But because of this sort of geopolitical might, the United States is still a strong haven. Even the surpluses in China, Japan, Russia, everywhere, rich persons, they put back, so to say, the money and sent it to the United States. Saddam Hussein, you remember him probably. Here he is. He took the bold move to switch the reserves of Iraq from dollars to euro in the year 2000. And some analysts say that it contributed to the invasion in 2003. That's perhaps a little of a conspiracy theory, but it was a factor, perhaps. And also this man in Iran, they switched from dollar to euro in 2001. And in January 2002, President Bush said that Iran was a part of the axis of evil. Of course, his argument was not that they have switched from dollar to euro, but it was perhaps a little factor. The Federal Bank, Federal Reserve Bank of New York, I checked on the internet just a week ago, and in May they held around 6,000 tons in total, most of it owned by foreign governments and central banks. They see the US as a safe haven in spite of the fact that US public debt to foreign investors was over $6 trillion in August 2015. So still they send their gold to United States because they are not afraid that somebody will come and take it there. And with this background, you can really ask, has US economic and political power, or imperialism, if you want to call it so, really been weakened and replaced by the empire, as Harter Negri claims? We will come back to that, but you can ask the question. Here is the famous golden bull outside Wall Street somewhere, New York. Okay, now we go over to a new interesting phenomenon. You recognize probably this man. Who is it? Who is this? Yeah, exactly. Deng. The new leader in China from 78, Deng Xiaoping, became world famous for saying that it doesn't matter whether a cat is white or black as long as it catches mice. The Communist Party kept its power monopoly and introduced a new paradigm of thinking. And here is Joseph Stiglitz. I have mentioned him. He says you have this text in the literature list, and I recommend it very much. He has an analysis of why China was more successful than Russia. And he says that the Chinese more gradual and controlled reform process worked much better than in Russia. Political dictatorship plus capitalism became a success story in spite of the conventional wisdom that capitalism evidently does not need political democracy. That was in my textbooks in economics when it said that you must have market economy and democracy. That's a twin pair that you must have. And if you have a planned economy, you have dictatorship. That was the sort of two sorts of possible systems, economic, political systems. But now China break out of this sort of, they prove that you could combine political dictatorship with capitalism. Also in Vietnam, the concept was doi moi. Came in Vietnam to create a so-called socialist-oriented market economy. And I was there actually in 1993. And there the system was described as a result of Marxism-Leninism revised by the former leader Ho Chi Minh's thinking. And I was invited to the headquarters of the Communist Party, and I asked them about this. What does it mean really? What in Ho Chi Minh's thinking said that you should combine Marxism-Leninism with? And that was very vague for me, but it meant evidently that some element of free markets should be combined with the old sort of Marxist-Leninist leading role of the party and the state and so on. Here is Ho Chi Minh. India had followed the neo-mercantilists or not school of dependence type of policies with a close cooperation with the Soviet Union. The economic liberalization with expanding private and foreign investment, reduction in tariffs and taxes, deregulation of markets was initiated in 91 under the dynamic. I read somewhere that he was called dynamic, I don't know. Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, here he is. And in Bengal and Kerala, even the communist-led left coalition governments, democratically elected, had a similar policy in the 1990s. When I met the former General Secretary of the Communist Party of India, Surjit Singh, here he is. He was here in Gothenburg, and I met him, a very interesting man. I asked about that, and he said that foreign capitalist investments was in line with the party ideology. So, no problem. Japan. Production in Japan until the beginning of the 1990s was based on large-scale capital investments, yielding impressive economies of scale. It took place within highly concentrated oligopolistic vertical conglomerates, hierarchical organizations that included their own large bank, factories, plus an intricate subcontracting system that involved countless small and medium-sized enterprises. A very peculiar sort of system, not according to the economics textbooks of the perfect competitive market, but it evidently worked quite well until the beginning of the 90s. But in the late 80s, a speculative asset price bubble of a massive scale was formed in Japan. Trying to deflate speculation and keep inflation in check, the Bank of Japan sharply raised interbank lending rates in the late 1989. And this sharp policy caused the bursting of the bubble, and the Japanese stock market crashed. And the collapse of the Soviet Union, together with sharper competition from China, also hit Japan's export industry hard. The country entered a long period of stagnation in the beginning of the 90s, and today even you could say that they are not definitely out of this sort of long stagnation period. After the US financed wars in Korea and Vietnam, the Southeast Asian tigers, I talked about them last time, South Korea, Thailand, Malaysia and Singapore became important economic and political allies to Japan and the United States. After 1991, they became less important as strategic allies for the United States. As Japan, they were also hit by competition from China and Vietnam, and their policy to peg their currencies to the dollar. The Asian crisis started in Thailand in 1997, where the government was forced to float the baht, the currency called the baht, when its foreign debt made the country effectively bankrupt even before the collapse of its currency. As the crisis spread, most of Southeast Asia saw slumping currencies, devalued stock markets and other asset prices, and a sharp rise in private debt. Indonesia, South Korea and Thailand were the countries most affected by the crisis. Hong Kong, Laos, Malaysia and the Philippines were also hurt. Africa. You could say that the Soviet collapse had a positive impact in Africa insofar as the West's fear for their allies among governments and liberation movements diminished. And the release of Nelson Mandela from his prison in 2000 was a symbol of optimism spread over the continent. But colonialism and liberation wars had also created polarized societies with political leaders like Mobutu in Zaire and wealthy elites living on incomes coming from multinational companies, exploiting their raw materials with bribery and corruption. Here is Mobutu, if some remember him. Also in Africa, countries like Tanzania, who had followed the neo-mercantilist, so-called by the Soviet non-capitalist development policies, or even socialist policies, had to adapt to the new economic Washington consensus type of economic system and open up to the global capitalist market. Well, now over a little to Europe. Like Japan, West German capitalism in the 1970s and 80s had shown a magnificent capacity for efficiently producing the most desirable and innovative industrial products like that. But unlike Japan, Germany had the advantage of its European periphery, which provided demand for its industrial products. The collapse of the Soviet Empire and reunification of Germany strained Germany's public finance with approximately $1.3 billion, but it also made cheap labor available for Germany in former GDR, Poland, Ukraine, and Hungary. Here is Helmut Kohl, he who could drink a lot of cream and eat butter. When the European Union currency system collapsed in 1991-92, German politicians wanted a common currency. And the elites in the deficit countries were tired of devaluations that hit their bank accounts, and their working class were also tired of inflation eating their wages. That's a very simplified political analysis, but anyway. The collapse of the Soviet system was also a strong impulse for a united Europe, based on a somewhat more social agenda compared to the Washington consensus, but on the whole not so different. At the meeting in Maastricht in 1991, European states entrenched in treaty form a timetable and set of conditions for a monetary union. Essentially, states wishing to be part of the union had to commit themselves to the prevailing principles of macroeconomic orthodoxy: a low inflation rate, reduced government deficits, the stabilization of their currency, and an independent central bank. And unemployment, income distribution were not variables in the treaty. They will be as they are if you follow the general macroeconomic principles. And here, anybody recognizing him? Yeah, Varoufakis, Yanis Varoufakis, a former Greek Ministry of Finance. He has written a very interesting book. I read it after I made the course list, but next time, if I ever get the chance, I will put him in the course list. In the book, The Global Minotaur, 2015. He says, just as the Americans in Bretton Woods insisted on preserving their rights to run large surpluses, so the Germans in Maastricht demanded that the treaty should not include any explicit recycling mechanism. You know, recycling mechanism. The money, the surplus money in the surplus countries being recycled to the deficit countries to see to it that those countries could expand. Instead, the Germans wanted the deficit countries to provide Germany with effective demand for its exports. The difference was that the US, in a Keynesian spirit, supported Germany and Japan with generous capital injections, but Germany refused to do the same with Italy and Greece. Well, as you know, the euro was introduced in the 1st of January 1999. The forming of the European Monetary Union at first seemed to be a much easier process than expected. Hurrah, hurrah, everyone said. Now we have got the euro. A success. But history struck. 11th of September 2001, many feared deflation, and Federal Reserve's interest rate was lowered from 6.5 to 1% to avoid a sort of depression. Together with a new wave of tax cuts by the government Bush and wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the US instead entered a boom. Also in the European Union, interest rates were lowered and credits expanded. Many countries experienced high economic growth and rising stock and real estate markets. Here is Bush. And here is, who is this? Oh, you might not remember him. Yes, Alan Greenspan, that's right. The famous chairman, he was a sort of guru for the whole financial world. He said in 2004, so long as markets are free and human beings exhibit swings of euphoria and distress, the business cycle will continue to plague us. But even granting human imperfections, flexible economic institutions appear to significantly ameliorate the amplitude and duration of the business cycle. The benefits seem sufficiently large that special emphasis should be placed on searching for policies that will foster still greater economic flexibility and dismantle policies that contribute to unnecessary rigidity. So go on and deregulate. Let the market be free. In the US, the purpose of the housing credit companies Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac was to give loans also to rather poor people, so-called subprime loans. It's said that President Bush once said that it's very good that poor people get a house of their own. Then they will vote for us Republicans and not for the Democrats. I don't know if that's true. They were financed through so-called mortgage-backed securities, allowing their lenders to reinvest their assets into more lending and in effect increasing the number of lenders in the mortgage market by reducing the reliance on locally based savings and loans. In the financial sector, those risky loans were sliced up in tiny pieces, blended together in packages that contained different degrees of risk and sold all over the world, also in Sweden. By thus spreading financial risks, so the story was told, no single agent faced any significant danger that they would be hurt if some debtors went bankrupt. Also, a number of countries in Europe experienced a period of boom. Ireland, the Celtic tiger, between 1991 to 2008 was transformed from one of Europe's poorer countries into one of its wealthiest. The success story was attributed to cheap loans, foreign direct investment, and a low corporation tax rate. Also, Spain in this period had fast economic growth because of low interest rates on international loans and favorable taxes encouraging private ownership. The country experienced a building boom with hotels and private housing, especially in the tourist areas. Here is a picture of the building boom. Shortly after joining the single currency, 2001, also Greece enjoyed a period of fast growth. Subsidies came from the European Union and cheap loans from the United States. German and French banks were practically foisted on the Greek state and companies. And to that came this phenomenon, Athens Olympia 2004. It was a new, hurrah, we are best in the world. Everything went up. The economic growth in Greece actually 2000 to 2004 was extremely high. And in academic economics, neoliberal optimism ruled. The efficient market hypothesis said that financial markets ensure that current prices reveal all the privately known information that there is. Some market players overreact to new information, others underreact. When everyone errs, the markets gets it right. The rational expectations hypothesis said that no one can predict the effects of a political action. For example, an expansionary fiscal policy, because people will see through them and counteract, leading to higher inflation. And the real business cycle theory said that capitalist markets respond efficiently to external shocks like wars or natural disasters. In the beginning of the new millennium, dynamic stochastic general equilibrium, so-called DSGE, macro-mathematical models were developed and used in the central banks and government economic institutions. They had 5 key features: an explicit description of individual preferences and firm objectives, forward-looking behavior called rational expectations, as I said, resource and budget constraints, explicit descriptions of shocks that can affect the economy. Some of those models, called new Keynesian model, very smart to take Keynes into the model, were based on infrequent price and wage adjustments, and so could include some elements from the old Keynesian tradition. And a well-known Princeton professor David Colander wrote, "There is a growing consensus that a new synthesis has been reached called the DSGE synthesis. Credible inflation targeting has become a key policy advocated on the basis of this new synthesis model. One can see it as a return to the broader classical question and the beginning of a true new classical revolution." I took as an example the European Central Bank's dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model from 2007. And I understand that you cannot grasp this thing in a couple of minutes, but just to get a very general picture. You have the households, they are consumers and they could save and they supply labor. Then you have production, companies in production, they combine labor and capital. And then you have the rest of the world, outside the euro area, in this case, where they have foreign demand and oil prices and that sort of factors. And then you have final goods imported to the area. And then you have lots of equations with 50 endogenous variables and so-called autoregressive processes for the model structural shocks and the VAR, what's that? Excuse me, I should have checked. What? Yes, could be, yes. And VAR, yeah, okay, good. I will use that next time. Models for government consumption and the foreign variables, measurement equations and identities. And here is the boss, Jean-Claude Trichet, on the 7th of August 2008. It was correct to raise the interest rate in July. The inflation rate will be too high during a longer period. To raise the interest rate. Why do you raise the interest rate? Because you think that the economy is going too fast upwards. It's risk for inflation. You must stop it. So it was right of us to raise the interest rate. And the model tells us exactly what will happen. So don't come and say that we are wrong. And I will take also the Swedish central bank, also of course used a DSG model called the Ramses model. And the prognosis below was the basis for the decision of the bank to rise the interest rate from 4.5 to 4.75% on the 3rd of September 2008. And you see here what the model said. Well, it's going a little down, but now it will go up again. So it's better to raise the interest rate to stop so that we don't get a sort of too much of a boom. And here is Stefan Ingves, who is still the boss of the Swedish central bank. He said that in many countries a somewhat lower inflation is expected. In spite of that, central banks probably will have to handle a permanent higher rate of inflation. He was very, very wrong. In a speech as chairman of the American Economic Association in 2003, Robert Lucas, here he is. He was the winner of the economics so-called Nobel Prize in 1995. He said, macroeconomics was born as a distinct field in the 1940s as a part of the intellectual response to the Great Depression. The term then referred to the body of knowledge and expertise that we hoped would prevent the recurrence of that economic disaster. My thesis in this lecture is that macroeconomics in this original sense has succeeded. Its central problem of depression prevention has been solved for all practical purposes and has in fact been solved for many decades. History repeats itself. In the end of the 1960s, I told you about what Paul Samuelson and others said. Now we know how to handle the economy. We will never experience any more crisis because we have our smart mathematical models telling us what to do. And again, this sort of euphoria was expressed. But not everyone was as optimistic as Lucas. In April 2005, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker, said this: "What holds the US success story together is a massive and growing flow of capital from abroad, running to more than 2 billion every working day. As a nation, we don't consciously borrow or beg. We aren't even offering attractive interest rates, nor do we have to offer our creditors protection against risk of a declining dollar, and the central banks in the emerging world have been willing to hold more and more dollars. The US is absorbing 80% of the net flow of international capital." This cannot go on indefinitely. I don't know of any country that has managed to consume and invest 6% more than it produces for so long time. He understood that this couldn't go on. And one can ask, how come that people can be so stupid that they, or the big majority of not only economists. This was the general sort of attitude before the big financial crisis. But yeah, that was my last slide for this lecture. So now I hope you have some question or comment.
about the models the central banks uses to make their monetary policy. Isn't that in kind of giving up the surprise effect, the possibility of the surprise effect, and undermining the monetary policy itself?
Yes, you could say that they believe that by building in shocks into the model, for instance, events like 11th of September or the revolt in Egypt and Tunisia could be handled in the model. They thought by having variables saying that suddenly something can happen with some basic variables, but then they have built in the model mechanisms that make it that the market will respond in a rational way to this, so that perhaps it takes some time, but the market will handle also this sort of external unexpected events. And you could say that that is the very general problem in my profession. Friedrich von Hayek, this interesting right-wing, he criticized Keynes, but he said something in his Nobel Prize lecture that I think was very correct, that economists believe that they can be like physicists. They can make models of the same sort as Newton and Einstein and so on, but they are wrong. It's too complicated. You can't catch the economy in a mathematical model. So that is the basic problem. And as a matter of fact, if I can say that, this department of global studies, you have the similar things all over the world. It was from the beginning a sort of revolt against economics. It was started by some of my students actually here in Gothenburg, and my colleagues were very, very critical. This was strange sociologists and social anthropologists and peculiar people. Flummig, what's that in English? No. What is it? Flummig. Okay. What? Whimsical, something like that. And especially, that was interesting, we got some people from Latin America, real hardliner. They were economists, but also left-wingers. They were very angry about this sort of, we want to have real economics thing, not this whimsical sort of, You had something.
Yes, when you were talking about economics and mathematics, I wonder, do you know who Martin Armstrong is? Martin Armstrong is I saw a documentary about him, the forecaster. He foretells what happens in the future and through mathematics.
Perhaps I have heard about him, but I'm not sure.
And he said like 10 years before the crisis in 2008, he said that that would come because he had some economic mathematic what do you say, mathematic program he had developed, and he said that history repeats itself. So
but I would say that you always find persons saying the right thing. I mean, you had other people saying that, warning for this, but I would dare to say that that you can't formulate the total social and economic and sort of cultural dynamic in the system in a mathematical model. So he was lucky, probably. I would believe, I would guess. Well, if you haven't got anything more, we will meet. It's a problem, Kenneth, that you will have to move, you know that, to another location